Claire Giordano, who is our speaker for today.
You know, there's a conference in San Jose in the fall.
We don't talk about that one.
You don't I'm in Silicon Valley.
So thank you for coming tonight. I know after a long day, is this working? Do I have to hold it closer like that? Okay, cool. Yeah, my voice is not as deep as either of these gentlemen, so I need the microphone to project. So I'm super excited to be here. Big thank you to Nextdoor for the space and to Stacy and Christoph for organizing. It turns out that Nextdoor is right next door to where I work. So I thought that was kind of amusing as I walked over here, and it was wonderful that I didn't have to fight traffic, and I'm sure you guys did. So thank you for fighting your way here and making it here on an evening. So can you hear me okay? Okay, let's get started. So I'm here to talk about why Postgres, why this database, and why now. And before I start, I am going to tell you just a little bit about myself, because when I'm in an audience and I'm listening to someone give a talk, I like to know a little bit about them, and just to have that context in terms of where they're coming from. So I'm a principal PM manager at Microsoft. I landed at Microsoft by way of Citus Data. How many of you heard of Citus? Cool, so more than half, that's awesome. So we are a company that scales up Postgres horizontally, and I joined Citus back in April of 2017. And I headed up marketing during my years there. And our big news, of course, is that we were acquired by Microsoft earlier this year, which is kind of cool in lots of ways. So I started my career, though, as a developer. I've spent more years in engineering than I have on the marketing side of the house. My degree was in math and computer science, and my very first job was in developer tools at Sun Microsystems, working on a predecessor to a predecessor to a predecessor to modern day Git and GitHub. And I spent about 16 years at Sun, most of it as an engineering manager in the kernel group. So my team created resource management and Solaris zones and things like that. And then I pivoted to work in product management and product marketing. So you could say now that my preferred programming language is now English, because that's how I spend my days. And my IDE those are things like Outlook and Google Drive and Microsoft Word and things like that. So now, as I said, worked at Citus, now work at Microsoft. One of the things I always point out when I give a talk is I throw up a picture of our Git repo, because I find it's a really visual way to drive home the fact that Citus is open source, which is important to me. It's one of the reasons that I joined the company. So Postgres is open source, as is Citus. Earlier in my career, I was in charge of open sourcing the Solaris operating system. And so it's a big part of our psyche within the team that we want to give back and we want to contribute to the community. And that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight. Oh, and I circled the stars only because maybe this is the marketer in me, but social proof influences people's behavior. So when somebody new discovers you and they go to your Git repo and they see like a really small number of stars, they think, oh, nobody else thinks this is interesting, maybe it's not very good. And so I always try, whether it's Citus or other communities, other projects that I'm a fan of, I always try to throw them a star. All right, so why am I here? This tweet was the inspiration for this talk. So I first met Matt Acey about 15 years ago. Right now he's head of developer ecosystems at Adobe. He's also a freelance writer in the technology space. So you'll see him writing articles in like Tech Republic or InfoWorld or things like that. But when he pushed out this tweet, I had just met with him the week before. We were both at reInvent, and so we got together for coffee. And I was telling him, look, you haven't written about Postgres in over a year. What's going on? You're publishing all these articles. You should be talking about Postgres. So I'd like to think that this tweet and the subsequent series of articles that he's written about Postgres, that I was the trigger for that. I don't know if it's true, but that's kind of what I'm gonna believe in. But this particular tweet made me wonder, why is it that people's eyes light up when you talk to them about Postgres? And that's true whether they're developers who work on it, consultants who consult on it, or users whose business depends on it. And I mean, people's eyes literally light up. How's the lighting on this in the back of the room? Does it look okay? All right. Does anybody recognize this person? A few of you do. Okay, yeah. His name's Dimitri Fontaine. He's an engineer who works on Postgres. He lives in France. Technically, he's on the contributor list for Postgres. He created something called PG Loader that loads data into Postgres using continuous migration tools. He's also written a book called Mastering Postgres, and this is not meant to be marketing for Postgres, but I went around when I was at PGConf.eu and I took pictures of people whose eyes really do light up when you talk to them about this database. So this is Peter Eisentraut of Second Quadrant. Laetitia Avro also works in the Postgres space at Webedia in France. And not just Europeans. This gentleman here is Stephen Frost. So he's the CTO of a company called Crunchy Data that hires a lot of people with Postgres expertise. And they actually, one of the cool things is they publish a lot of blogs that are super useful and interesting. But again, why did I take these pictures? Well, because it was a nice lead-in for this talk. Why Postgres? Why now? Why this database? So what I'm going to do is walk you through the lessons I've learned in my first 2 years working at Citus. Because earlier in my career, I worked on other things, right? Containers, developer tools, scale-out storage, but not databases. So I had to drink from the fire hose. And so I'm going to walk you through what I've learned and what I believe to be the 10 reasons that so many people have so much affection for Postgres. And where people is developers, but also advocates, users, contributors, community members, marketers who really want the world to know about it. And I'm going to do it in reverse order. And the first one's going to be kind of obvious, right? I'm going to start with the fact that Postgres is open source. Now, you guys all know that. I'm not going to insult your intelligence, but it's pretty fundamental. And the reason I put it here is because I wanted to peel the onion and try to figure out, well, why does the open sourceness of Postgres actually influence its growing popularity? And I'm going to walk through a couple of what I think the reasons are. And the first is that obviously it's free, as in freedom, not free as in price, but free as in liberty, to run, copy, distribute, change, modify, sell, do whatever the heck you want to it. But one of the reasons I like, as a former engineer and a former engineering manager, is when it's open source, it's super easy to kick the tires, right? To download it. I'm also a night owl, right? So I typically, like, some of my best ideas come to me at midnight or 1 in the morning. And at midnight, you can download packages and try something out. And learn more about it. And that isn't always possible with proprietary solutions that are more limited in your access. And then also, you can avoid vendor lock-in. So this was a really big deal before Microsoft acquired us and when Citus was a startup. Because when prospective customers would talk to us about using Citus to scale out Postgres, you know, they were a little concerned sometimes about the risk. Like, what if your startup goes away? Well, the fact that Citus was open source mitigated some of that risk for customers and mitigated the concerns they had about doing business with a startup. They felt like, worst case, at least the code is open source and it's public and there are other people out there with expertise to work on it. Then there's the ecosystem. So the fact that Postgres is open source has led to this thriving ecosystem, right? There are people out there with expertise in it. There are consultants. There are integrations with all sorts of applications and tooling. Okay, you guys know all this. I'm going to speed up through the open source section. And then there's transparency, which I think is really, really important, especially when it comes to trust. But how many of you have contributed code to an open source project? Okay, so almost half. So first of all, thank you. I think it's actually really uncomfortable sometimes to take your code and integrate it and bear with the public scrutiny and all those eyeballs and all the criticism that comes publicly with people finding bugs in your software. It was a lot easier when I first started in my career, and if I did, try to integrate something that had some problems, maybe 10 people would know about it. Now it's out there for the world to see. Obviously, it's good for our users and our customers, and it probably makes those of you who do it better engineers for it. Probably makes you more hireable and more recruitable, too. But it is an important factor. And then finally, the fact that Postgres is open source means it's not a black box. Users can look around, they can look at the code, but it's not just about the code. The design, particularly in the case of Postgres, the design decisions and the trade-offs that are made when people are making architectural decisions are available. They're public. So how many of you have ever gone and kind of poked around the Postgres mailing lists and either looked at the archives or maybe you subscribe to them, right? There is a wealth of information there that's available about why people make the decisions they do, and I think that's powerful. So when I was sharing this with an engineer named Jeff Davis, who is a Postgres committer, one of the things he brought up is this quote from Simon Riggs that, oh yeah, Simon was giving this talk at an event and he said, it's not open source, it's open engineering. And I thought that was kind of a really powerful way to look at it. So these are all the reasons why I think open source just has to be number 10 on the list, and we have to start from there. All right. So now let's talk about community. The Apache community has this wonderful phrase called community over code, or sometimes people say come for the code, stay for the community. But the fact that Postgres is open source has helped given birth to this wonderful, amazing Postgres community. So this picture was taken at PGConf last fall in Lisbon, Portugal. And the room was full, there were over 400 people there, and it was full of not just developers who work on Postgres, but developers who use Postgres, who build their applications on top of it, spouses of people who are developers, people who have formed and founded startups based on this technology, consultants. It was just full of all sorts of different types of people. And I think that I was surprised at how vibrant and excited everybody was to be there and to collaborate and talk about what was going on and what the latest features were. So I do think community is a big part of it. And the Postgres community is global. So I put pins on this map for all of the community events that have occurred so far this year. So what are we in July? So almost the first 7 months of the year. There have been community events that in Paris, Israel, Singapore, Copenhagen, Pasadena, Leipzig, Germany, Bologna, Amsterdam, Lyon, the list goes on. Ottawa, Ibiza even. Ibiza, that sounded pretty cool. I didn't get to go to that one. Boston, and I think London was just a couple weeks ago too. And then there's all the meetups. Does anybody recognize this picture? You know where this is? Someone's got to know where it is. Cuba. So there's even a Postgres community in Cuba. So when I was researching and trying to learn the space, I found that there was a paper presented at PGCon in Ottawa back in 2016 from Gilberto Castillo Martinez. And he talked about all of his research and teaching about Postgres in Cuba. And there's even a PG Cuba event that occurs every year. And this just amazed me that this Postgres community is thriving of its own accord in a country that has been isolated, not from the whole world, but certainly from some big parts of the world for so long. So community matters. Now we've got reason number 8, not Oracle. So I actually thought long and hard about whether to include this as part of the story. Do I want to be that person? I don't want to be that person who is negative or who trash talks some competitor. So that is not me. However, I think the fact that Postgres is not proprietary and is not Oracle is a big part of the reason why it's been growing in popularity. It certainly is more affordable to deploy a fully featured Postgres deployment. It's less expensive when you compare capital and software and people as compared to Oracle. But it's not just about the economics of it. Most teams that I know who are starting new businesses, who are starting new projects, are not choosing Oracle to start that project. I think a lot of people don't want to do business with them anymore. They've heard really bad things about their contracts and the way they enforce them and how much it can end up costing you if an engineer accidentally turns on a feature and doesn't realize it. And so I think that's given Postgres a competitive edge too. And when I was having this conversation with a man named Dave Kramer, who works also at Crunchy Data in the Postgres space, he's an engineer, and he has a friend who works at a big bank in Canada who was telling him the story about going to have a meeting with Oracle about renewing their contract. And the Oracle team brought 2 lawyers to the meeting. So, and the big bank didn't bring any lawyers, and so they felt outgunned. So that made me think of this Bonkers World cartoon, and I thought I'd throw it up there. And I can't believe it's possibly true that this is the ratio between lawyers and engineering at Oracle, but I thought I would try to at least make some of you smile. I don't think it worked that well, though. Okay, now maybe it did. Thank you for that. All right, so number 7, permissive license. So this is actually a code snippet from it's almost all the code. It's almost everything in the Postgres open source license. It is a very permissive open source license. You can pretty much do anything you want. So back when I worked on Open Solaris, I spent a lot of time working with lawyers and engineers and open source community members. And I actually led the team that created an OSI approved open source license called CDDL, or CUDL is how we pronounced it. So I've forgotten more about open source licensing than a lot of people know. And I wouldn't claim to be an expert in this space anymore, but I do have experience, and I will take a stand and agree with something that Peter Van Hardenberg said, that forks make the community strong. So I don't know if any of you know Peter Van Hardenberg, but he gives a fabulous talk called The Illustrated History of Postgres. He made the rounds a couple years ago, and there's at least one recording available online. It's a really interesting talk. If you use the database today and use the technology, but actually aren't familiar with the history, it's worth walking through. But one of the key byproducts of Postgres and this open source license is that it has generated more expertise, more people who are experts with more familiarity and awareness. And this is a partial list, and I mean very partial. The list is much, much longer than this, of all the forks, or as it says, the derived databases that are based on Postgres. And this is from one of the PostgreSQL wikis. And it has allowed all these teams, all these companies, all these projects to do all sorts of different things, and that has grown the community too. Now we're going to jump to reason number 6, trust. So when I interviewed people leading up to putting together this talk, and I asked them, what do people value most about Postgres? People would always say the data integrity. Or they would say all of the hardening that's gone into the database over the last few decades. Particularly when you're contrasting it to some of the newer databases that have just come out, right, that are brand new source bases. People will talk about maintainability and robustness, and so I had to put it on the list because it seemed like something that most developers I talked to really valued. And then I tried to figure out, well, what's a proof point? Like, what can I show? And I decided to use social proof. So Brander is an engineer who works at Stripe, who used to work at Heroku. I've actually never met Brander, but I do follow Brander on Twitter, and I read the blog posts that Brander writes, because they're super amazingly, not only are they interesting and they're about complex topics, but he also makes his information really accessible to someone like me who hasn't written a line of code in over a decade. So he writes for both a technical audience and audiences who are, say, less technical. But one of the things he said earlier this year is he submitted a patch for review to the Postgres team, and he said it floors him every time. How that patch review was given so much attention to detail, so much thoughtfulness, so much effort invested. And as compared to other projects that he's been party to, he was hugely impressed. So I thought this was a good example of how that dedication that the Postgres team brings to all of the commit fests and all of the patch reviews was an important factor in our growth. All right, Heroku. So how many of you have ever used Heroku to build an app? Okay, a bunch of you. So when Heroku first started, they didn't have a database that was included in their offering. And as I was talking to Peter Van Hardenberg, who used to be head of the data team at Heroku, he was explaining to me that Rails developers would come to the Heroku team and they would say, hey, we really would like you to include a database, right? That would make our lives so much easier. So when they finally did, when Heroku standardized on Postgres, that seemed to cause the Ruby on Rails community to veer toward Postgres. and a whole lot more adoption happened. And of course, those engineers have gone on to other companies and join other teams, and that's helped Postgres proliferate even more too. All right, so now, NoSQL did not eat the world. I had to put this on here. I worked in a scale-out storage offering back around 2011, and I mean, you said you founded Nextdoor around 2010. So if you read a lot of the articles that were being written in the tech trade at that time, it seemed to me like NoSQL was going to take over the world. Like it was going to take over half the market share from the relational database world. Everybody was talking about key value and document stores, and that's not what happened. NoSQL did not take over the world. And in fact, Postgres is still heating up. It's growing like gangbusters. So this chart maps, it's from Hacker News Trends, and it maps the number of times the database technologies are mentioned in all the hiring submissions that go to Hacker News. And I think it's an awesome trend line for Postgres, not so good for MySQL and MongoDB. In addition, let's see, Postgres was just given the Lifetime Achievement Award at OSCON just last week. Christoph stood up on stage to receive that award. It's DBMS of the year, according to DB Engines, for the last 2 years, 2017, 2018. Stack Overflow developers in their survey rated it as, I think it's number 2, unfortunately, the second most loved database of all of the databases. But it's absolutely having a moment and heating up. Okay, so there's a few more reasons that I believe Postgres has been growing in popularity. And this one goes back into history a little bit, and it's the timing of JSON and JSONB support being added into Postgres. So there might be some JSON experts in the room who know a heck of a lot more about this history than me. So how many of you would consider yourself a JSONB expert in Postgres? Anybody gonna raise their hands? Okay, Christoph, there, thank you. I'm glad you raised your hand. So what strikes me is that sometimes, and this is the former engineering manager and me talking, sometimes a team will wait until the proof is incontrovertible. The handwriting is on the wall. We absolutely have to support this new technology, this new API, this new application, whatever it is. And in this case, I think the Postgres community could have waited longer, and that would have been bad. And instead, they came out early. And the original JSON support in 9.2 wasn't perfect, but they got it out there. And it was fairly easy to do because Postgres has an extensible type system. So it wasn't actually that hard to implement it. I'm told that for MariaDB, it took them years to develop JSON support. And this allowed JSON to be used as a document store with no predefined schemas. And as developers reached that kind of valley of disappointment with some of the brand new NoSQL databases, the JSON support was waiting for them in Postgres when they wanted to come back. I wasn't there at the time, but I'm told that the initial performance benchmarks that came out for Postgres and JSON put Postgres in a really favorable light. So I'm looking at you, Christoph, to validate if that was true or not. Yes. And so we came out with JSON 9.2, JSONB 9.4. Performance benchmarks were rock solid, and I think that brought a lot of people into the fold. Okay, so number 2, PostGIS. So if you work with Postgres, you probably knew this was going to be on the list. You had to know this was coming. In fact, when I gave this talk in Lisbon last fall, Tom Lane was in the room, and I didn't know what he looked like, so I didn't know he was in the room, so I wasn't nervous at all, which is great. I'm really glad. But he stood up afterwards and made a few comments, and one of the things he asked is that I emphasize that PostGIS has been important to the spread of Postgres. And he told me that in those early days, the Postgres community actually took specific steps in Postgres to help PostGIS get off the ground. So for those of you who don't know, PostGIS is the industry standard way to model spatial data in a database. And if you think about, well, why does PostGIS matter? Well, it matters because location is that universal foreign key. I mean, location seems to be in so much of the data that's being captured today. And another reason to think about why PostGIS and geospatial support in databases matters is this picture that I put up earlier in the talk. PostGIS enables people to do spatial storytelling. And this picture is so much more powerful than if I had put a list up here of all the community events that had occurred in the world earlier this year, because it tells several stories. First of all, it shows you that Europe has it going on. This is not me being Eurocentric. This is not me ignoring Asia. I was actually born in Taiwan. I don't ignore Asia. This is not me not caring about the United States because I live here. Europe has a really active Postgres community, and they do these wonderful things called PG Days, and I hope to see more and more of them happening in the US in the next year and a half. But it's a powerful way to display and tell stories about information. So let me share with you something else that's interesting about PostGIS. So the keynote speech at PGConf EU last year was about PostGIS. We spent about 45 minutes, maybe an hour on it. Paul Ramsey gave the talk. And one of the things that he did in his talk is he shared a quote from a man named Waldo Tobler, who was a professor who unfortunately died last year. He was an American-Swiss cartographer and geographer, and he coined what's called Tobler's first law of geography, which is that everything is related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So first of all, I actually think that's a cool phrase. And second of all, I would like to coin a first law of something. I think that would be cool to have a Wikipedia page about, Claire Giordano's first law of blank, but I'm pretty far along in my career and I have not managed to make that happen yet. But Waldo Tobler did, and interestingly, I gave this talk recently in Zurich, and somebody came up to me afterwards, and he had been Waldo Tobler's student. And he was so excited that, his work, his learnings, his thinking is still influencing people to this day. But because we have so much more data today with all these location components, the universal foreign key, if you will, that has led to the increased importance of PostGIS, which in turn has led to the proliferation of Postgres, which is kind of cool. So now, I'm going to share with you what I believe to be the number one reason that Postgres has been growing in popularity. And I don't know if anybody can read my mind or guess what it is. Any thoughts? Not if you've seen the talk before, though. No, not Teresa. You don't get to say anything. Any guesses? All right. What? No, not Citus. That would be too biased. Extension APIs. So in layman's term, one analogy that I use, I'm not sure if the logic totally holds, is that the PostgreSQL APIs are similar to, say, the SDK that underpins the whole mobile app ecosystem. I was having dinner with someone last fall getting ready for this talk, and I was talking about how I thought the Postgres extension APIs were one of the most powerful influencers of the spread of Postgres and all the innovation we're seeing. And this person said, yeah, we are still dining out on the radical design decision by Michael Stonebreaker in the design of Postgres to have runtime extensions. And I put the quote on here for two reasons. One, I'm a bit of a wordy now because English is my preferred programming language, and I'd never heard that phrase. We're still dining out on something. And I thought it was kind of cool. And I had to think about it. It made me stop and think about, well, what does he mean by that? And I finally figured out that, oh, okay, we're so successful, we can go out to eat every night. We're dining out on this thing. And then it made me want to go look up Michael Stonebreaker's original design of Postgres paper, which I had not read. Now, how many of you here have read it, have looked at it? Cool, a few of you, that's awesome. It's not that long. It's actually fairly easy to read, like anything complex, right? There was, I'm sure, a lot of work that went into it, but it seems simple when you read it. But sure enough, this thing is published in 1986, and design principle number 2 is right there. Provide user extendability for data types, operators, and access methods. I mean, that was part of the vision from the very beginning. And these Postgres extensions that people are able to create have empowered a ton of innovation, from little tiny utilities like PG cron, where you can run cron jobs within the database without having to, put them out and manage a separate server, to startups who get acquired by big technology companies who are really committed to open source, like Microsoft, right? And I'm that startup, kind of cool. But one of the other things that I find so powerful about the extension APIs is that not everybody has to agree up front. So back when, in order to make something happen in Postgres, you had to persuade the core committers, right, to accept it, persuade those patch reviewers to accept it into the code base. You can have a wacky idea now and go off and build it, build a whole company around it, and people don't have to agree. And I think that lays the groundwork for what I call unpredictable innovation, where, oh, people wouldn't have predicted that that would be successful, but wow, it was, which is kind of cool. So then I put up a few, in case some of you are not familiar with the Postgres extension APIs, there are a boatload of them. And you can go online and Google it and find out more about them. And there's a whole bunch of tools that exist, and they're open source. They're available on GitHub in many cases. And I put PostGIS at the top of the list. I have no skin in the game with PostGIS, but it really does seem to be the most famous one that people talk to me about. When you ask them, you know, what's the most impactful Postgres extension that you can think of, PostGIS is usually what people will tell you. And then because I'm biased, I put Citus next on the list. But that's not just because of my own personal career success and my bias. It's also because it's been really rewarding for me to interview users and who have talked and waxed philosophical about how much their business and their technology stack has benefited from using the combination of Postgres and Citus. And then I put pgpartman on here just because more and more time series data is a thing, and the ability to do time-based partitioning is really powerful. Barak Y is in the room. I put hyperloglog on the list because of Barak. He loves this thing. But seriously, for people who are doing anything with analytics, having these approximation algorithms that can get you to an answer that's guaranteed to be approximately correct in a really fast way, that is powerful. Another approximation algorithm that I have on the list is also TopN. I seriously didn't know that Barak and Furkan were going to be here because they don't even live in this country, and they didn't tell me they were coming into town. But Furkan created TopN. So that's for you. You've never seen me give this talk. I mentioned pgcron before. PGURI is interesting to me only because it's a Postgres extension that was created from a tweet. An engineer tweeted out to the world that it would be really useful if somebody could create a Postgres extension that would allow us to filter and index parts of a URL, like, you know, pull out a host name, for example. And Peter Eisentraut decided to accommodate, and I don't know, I think it was a couple days later, maybe it was a couple weeks. Urban Lore changes stories a little bit, but then he tweeted back a reply with a link to that Git repo. So again, didn't need to get anybody's buy-in or commitment to do that, just created it, and then, you know, people can discover it and use it from there. So I put these favorites on there. Before I switch slides, I'm curious, do any of you have a amazingly powerful favorite Postgres extension that you think I should have had on this list?
Postgres NFUW is
Oh my goodness, you're so right. Foreign data wrapper?
just that particular one.
Yeah.
Earlier ones are great too, but it just saved me too much time at my job recently. So.
Yeah, I should have had foreign data wrapper on here and maybe even near the top of the list because that is amazingly powerful, and people, you're not the first person to have given me that feedback. Anything else? Any other favorites? Well, there's a ton more. And the cool thing is, there's also what people haven't yet created, haven't yet imagined, but are going to create. So every time I give this talk, I'm always kind of curious, like, who in this room is going to go home and start learning about Postgres extension APIs and then go create something as a result? And I'll never know that I was like the impetus for that, but it's a neat possibility to think about. Finally, there's two things I want to finish up on and say. It is really, really cool to work on a technology that people love. And people do love Postgres, especially when I talk to users, especially when they share with me the problems that they used to have and now all the things that they're able to do with Postgres. I'm thinking of one user in particular who uses a complex set of triggers in his Postgres environment, and it just delivers amazing performance. And so I am so glad that I accepted that offer at Citus a couple of years ago. And then finally, like to create this talk, I've had to learn a ton from a whole bunch of people. So I always throw up the credits at the end because I could not have learned all this the last 2 years without a lot of help. And then one more thing to tell you before I leave the stage, which is, those are my Twitter handles. That's not what I want to tell you. Oh, socks and stickers. So we did bring some super cool socks with us. I don't know, socks are our thing. I don't know how many of you are into cool socks. But these are limited edition pre-acquisition socks. So these are not going to exist for much longer because, as you can imagine, my new Microsoft colleagues want our socks to be Microsoft branded, which makes sense. I totally get it. I mean, that's the badge I'm wearing, says Microsoft on it. So yeah, that's cool. But we do still have some of these, and they're pretty cool. So these are Elicorns, because we make Postgres magic by scaling it out. So it's a combination of an elephant and a unicorn. And they're one size fits many. Doesn't fit everyone, but fits most people. And Teresa is in the back of the room wearing the gray hoodie, raising her hand. And so you can track her down. Yeah, she's got an Elicorn on the back of her shirt, too. So, and there's stickers, too. Now, do we have any questions? Yes. Do you need the questions on the mic for the video, or do you truncate?
If you could repeat back to the gist of the question.
Okay, I'll do that.
Oh, I was just curious, you obviously did an extensive interview process when your co-founder was taught. Did anybody have consistent gripes about Postgres that they wish would be addressed in future editions?
Did anybody have consistent gripes about Postgres that they wish would be addressed in future editions? I would say no, but that may be a fault in my interview style. I don't think I was looking for complaints. I was looking for, why do you think it's having a moment? Why do you think people's eyes light up? So I was searching for that positive story. I also think that there's already laundry lists of features that people want to be added to Postgres and things they need to happen, and a whole process for bringing those into reality. And so I felt like if I wanted the list of things to add and augment and extend, it was probably out there, so I guess I didn't really ask. But that could be a future talk. Can you imagine? Like, what are the gripes about Postgres? Furkan?
Maybe pluggable storage was something that the community wanted for a long time and then got implemented by Andres this time. So it's going Postgres 12. Yeah.
So Furkan is answering the question, I'm just saying this for the video, and we could pass a mic, to suggest that maybe pluggable storage was a gripe, but it is being added to Postgres 12, correct? By Andres?
Yeah, in my best.
Cool. Other questions? Yes?
What led you to go into product management?
What led me to go into product management? Well, that's interesting. Honestly, I went into product management and product marketing with a lot of kicking and screaming. I thought I was going to work my whole career in engineering, go from director to VP, and just kind of keep leading engineering teams. And we had and I had been running an engineering team where we were working on Solaris Zones, we were working on resource management. I think I had the volume manager, and I had a team who was working on open sourcing the operating system. And there was nobody to run product marketing for that. We were coming up on a launch. I'd been doing so much evangelization inside and outside the company because I didn't have a marketing counterpart, that people just said, well, we want you to run product marketing for this. And I said, no, I'm an engineering manager. And they said, but we really want you to do this. And I said, no. And I said no about 15 times. Teresa was there, she probably remembers. I think it took me 2 months to go from no to yes. And then I finally said yes. And then I've been made multiple offers to go back to be an engineering leader, and I wouldn't go back. I love working on the product management and product marketing side of the house. So it's too bad it took me 2 months, of negotiating to get there, but it's really, really fun, and I'd be happy to talk to you about why offline. Other questions? Anything about Postgres? How many of you, okay, do your eyes light up when you talk about Postgres? Do any of your eyes light up? Do any of you love it in your day-to-day work? Christoph? Okay, see, maybe I need to add your picture to the presentation. I've got a couple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for Com. What you doing there? Yeah, okay, 6. Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you. I mean, you did base your company on it.
PostGIS. That's why that was at the core of Nextdoor.
Oh, that's right. So not just Postgres, but PostGIS too.
Yeah.
Very cool. Yes, Bill.
Question. So sanitizing inputs for SQL, does the Postgres ecosystem make that easier or harder?
Sanitizing inputs for SQL. I'm going to turn to Christoph to give him a mic and have him help answer that question. But you need a mic because I'm not going to want to repeat what you say. Let's see if this puppy works. Yes.
So the answer to your question is it makes it easier, and I can actually, and that's not speculative. There is an extension library that it's still a little bit experimental, but it's specifically designed for masking data. So you can apply masking rules to it. What's nice about it is, I'm going to have to Google up the name of it, but there was a talk about it at the last the last PostgreSQL Europe conference, where it will it retains the data, the underlying data, but only presents it as masked depending on the user, the role that's doing the query. Which is nice because you still have the indexing and all that stuff. Still works, so the data is not actually munched on disk, it's just presented differently. And it's a Postgres extension, so you just drop it in like an extension. And then it uses the comments on the fields to hold the masking rules.
Okay.
So PostgreSQL data masking will probably get you the right place as a query.
Thank you.
Sure.
Other questions? Anybody? Going once. Going twice. I want to repeat something that Christoph said in the beginning. Postgres Open is the next big community event that's happening in the US, and it's in Florida. And is it 2 or 3 days long? 11 through 13, so that's
2 days of talks, 1 day of tutorials.
Okay, got it. In Orlando. And anyway, it used to be in San Francisco. So the last 2 years, Postgres Open was based here. And then I think it's going to be in Florida for the next 2 years. And they haven't published the schedule yet, but it should be coming out in the next couple of days. And registrations are open. So are you going to go?
Oh yeah, I'm speaking.
Okay, all right.
Stacey Hazler, who's PGX's chief operating officer, is also on the program committee for it. So she recused herself from my talk. So.
Got it. Any other questions or things we want to talk about? Stacy, did you?
I heard my name and I.
I was just.
You're on the program committee for Postgres Open.
And we've done the first round of top applications, and we're waiting to hear back from everybody, because some people aren't checking their email, like Dimitri. And as soon as we get the first round of confirmations, we'll do the second round. There will be 6 tutorials and 30 regular session talks.
Wonderful. And then you said your next meetup is going to be in September.
In September, yeah.
Here.
It will be in San Francisco. Watch the Skies. That is to say, the meetup group for where it'll actually for the details.
Awesome.
Right. Give a little quick closing.
Here, then let me give you the mic.
And thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Sure.
So very quickly, Postgres version 12 is in beta, and it's available for download. Please download it and test it, especially if you have large data sets and production data sets. Download it, bring it up in a dev environment, and run your application against it, and let us know how it goes. This kind of testing is invaluable. Lots of cool features. Probably the top line features are improvements in partitioning. The new declarative partitioning system in Postgres has gotten even better than it was before. The thing rising over the horizon is pluggable storage. The access method system has been expanded to include the underlying disk storage as well as indexing. You always had pluggable indexes, and now you have pluggable tables as well. There's not a lot that ships with Postgres right now, but this is going to be amazing in the future. So, and again, we'll meet again in September. Subscribe to the meetup group, and we will tell you all about that. And thank you again, Claire.
Thank you. Don't forget your socks.